We are back on Taking Care of Business on Current Radio, News Talk, 1180. Our guest by phone, Stephanie Deutsch, talking about a new book called You Need a Schoolhouse, the story of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald. Stephanie, you have some great stories in this book. I mean, it's a really fascinating read. I was flying off to see some family in Vancouver, and it's one of those books that I picked up and thought, okay, I'll skim it, but I didn't quite finish it. Then I got back on the plane going back, and I couldn't wait to pick up the book again to finish it. It's a great, great read. One of the stories you told that I thought was interesting was, because it kind of was a timepiece in a way, talking about everybody's attitude during this period, was Julius Rosenwald's chauffeur's response to driving Booker T. Washington.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. When Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald met, it was 1911, and it was in Chicago. They met at a luncheon. And after the luncheon, Rosenwald invited Washington to come out and visit Sears the next day. And they began their trip at Rosenwald's house. And his chauffeur, a white man, had said that he didn't want to drive. He didn't feel it was right for him to drive a black man. And Rosenwald said, "Well, I'll get someone else to drive if that's the case." And apparently, the chauffeur relented and said, "Well, if you're going to ride with him, I guess I can drive him." But it was a little bit groundbreaking, even in the North, to have the kind of warm, friendly relationship that the two men had.
Yeah, from what I could read in the book, it just didn't seem to be something that was socially acceptable, like you say, even in the North, which kind of surprised me that race relations was still at that kind of a freeze point at the turn of the century here in this country. What do you think brought the two of them together?
Well, I think shared values. I think they were both very other-oriented people. They weren't selfish. They wanted to do things that would benefit their individual communities, and then Rosenwald really expanded his sense of community beyond. He began his philanthropy with the Jewish community, which was typical of wealthy Jews, but then he began to think of the community as really the whole country, that the country could not thrive if part of the population was poorly educated and despised. And since Jews had very much had that experience of being a despised minority, he could identify with that.
And so he really felt a kinship then towards the black community.
Yes, and he mentioned that in many speeches. He mentioned that sense of kinship. He, in one speech, he said, "We love to criticize Russia for their treatment of the Jews." This was the time when there were pogroms, which were state-sanctioned riots against Jews. And he said, "We love to look down on the Russians, but we turn around and treat our black people just as badly."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Was the idea for the schools Rosenwald's idea?
No, I think it was Washington's idea. I think he asked Rosenwald to be on the board of Tuskegee, and but I think he was a very clever guy and a brilliant fundraiser, and he could see that Rosenwald was interested and that he liked Tuskegee very much. So when Julius Rosenwald made a $25,000 grant to him for Tuskegee, and Washington said, "How about if we took just $2,500 and used it to as seed money to build these schools?" So he was always thinking of more ways he could get people involved and interested.
Well, and all through the book you talk about Booker T. Washington's attempts at getting different people, influential people, on the board of Tuskegee, and he was quite a salesman. I mean, he really got a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of pull involved in the institute.
Absolutely. Theodore Roosevelt was on the board of Tuskegee. He was brilliant. That was one of his great strengths, was his ability to communicate the importance of this cause and of this institution.
Mm-hmm. What another speech that you talked about in the book was Frederick Douglass gave the self-made man speech at the institute at the graduation. I think it was the first graduation. I think. Can you talk a little about that speech? I love that speech.
Yeah. No, it wasn't the first graduation, but one of the subsequent graduations. Well, Frederick Douglass, of course, was the huge leader of the earlier part of the 19th century. And he used to go around and give a speech, The Self-Made Man, where he talked about the importance of many of the values that Washington talked about: education, supporting oneself, the values of family, of community, of not looking to other people to take care of you, but of supporting yourself and of being your own person, and of not letting the shadow of what they had come out of determine the future.
Our guest by phone, Stephanie Deutsch, is the author of You Need a Schoolhouse, the story of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, who is the guy who really built Sears, and their quest to build schools in the segregated South. So, I mean, basically, I was looking at the list of people that either got their education through the school system or ended up being recipients of the Rosenwald Trust, and it's a who's who of 20th century Black America.
The Rosenwald Fellowships were a remarkable program. They were individual stipends or fellowships that were given to people of merit, and yes, it was Marian Anderson, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, photographer Gordon Parks, many leaders in the intellectuals and artists benefited from the Rosenwald Fund.
Marian Anderson, Horace Bond, Julian Bond's father, Ralph Ellison,
exactly.
And even W.E.B. Du Bois.
And even W.E.B. Du Bois, exactly. Mm-hmm. Another thing I discovered recently that I had not known is that when, now Rosenwald himself was no longer living when this happened, but when the program to create the Tuskegee Airmen was being created at Tuskegee, the military had decided to set up the program, but funds were needed to build the airfield there. And the Rosenwald Fund lent the money that allowed Tuskegee to build an airfield there, and so contributed to that hugely important program.
Oh, incredible. He took the project. He was on the board of Tuskegee until he died in 1932. But right. he took the program away from Tuskegee.
He did. Washington died in 1915, and the demand for the schools in the years that followed that became so overwhelming that Tuskegee really didn't have the staff or they really were overwhelmed by the demand. And it was a very typical thing that Rosenwald did. Some feelings were hurt. There were some questions raised about, was it that he didn't trust black leadership? He always made the decision that he thought was best for the activity at hand. And he felt if he ran the school building program, he did it out of an office in Nashville, Tennessee, he could control the quality, he could make sure that the schools were built to certain specifications, and he was very strong about that. An example of this attitude that I appreciate is that when it came time to choose someone to follow him as president of Sears, he passed by his own son, Lessing Rosenwald, who wanted to be president of the company, and he chose someone else because he thought it would be better for the company.
It goes.
He's a very hard-headed businessman.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying about the pragmatism that he and Booker T. Washington both had. He didn't look at it in terms of race; he looked at it in terms of results, and they weren't getting the results, and he had this money for this project. We've got less than a minute left, Stephanie, but tell us about the National Trust. What's the National Trust doing with these schools?
The National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2002 named the schools that remain standing to their list of most endangered historic sites in America. And there are many, many places throughout the South where the Trust is assisting community groups in restoring the schools, turning them into community centers, senior centers, small museums. And it's a wonderful project that is very exciting.
And where can people find out about your book and get copies of the book? Who would they have to contact?
Well, my book is for sale at bookstores and on Amazon, and I have a website, www.youneedaschoolhouse.com, and I have a blog, and there's lots of information on there.
And I highly recommend it. Stephanie, thank you for the time. I really appreciate it. Great book.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you in 167 hours on Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio News Talk 1180.